This channel is for women who are doing fine, but feel quietly lost. There is a kind of night that does not look dangerous at all. Nothing is broken. Nothing is loud. The dishes are put away. The hallway is dim. The house is finally still. Maybe the television is off, maybe it is murmuring in the background to keep the silence from becoming too honest. Maybe a phone screen lights up for 1 second and goes dark again. Maybe a woman stands alone in her kitchen, one hand resting against the counter, feeling something she cannot name begin to rise inside her. From the outside, her life is intact. She is functioning. She is composed. She answers emails. She pays bills. She keeps appointments. She remembers birthdays. She knows how to smile at the grocery store, how to say I'm good without trembling, how to carry a full life with elegant hands. And yet there are moments, quiet, private, almost invisible moments, when she feels as though something in her has been left open. Not broken open. Not dramatically destroyed. Just open. Open in a way that makes rest feel farther away than it should. Open in a way that makes certain memories feel less like memories and more like living things. Open in a way that turns an ordinary evening into something heavier than it has any visible right to be. That is where this story begins. Because most people have no idea what can happen in the unseen world when you sleep with someone. They think the moment ends where the moment ends. They think it is over when the body leaves the room, when the text messages slow down, when the relationship is renamed, when the distance grows, when life moves on. They think intimacy is just an event. Just chemistry. Just a choice between two adults. Just a night. Just a season. Just something private. But there are women who know better, even if they have never had the language for it. They know because they have felt it. They have felt the strange heaviness that came after closeness. They have felt the confusion that arrived where peace used to live. They have felt the ache of still being tied to someone they no longer even want. They have felt the unsettling truth that a person can leave their life and still remain somewhere deep inside it. That is not nothing. That is not imagination. And that is not weakness. There are connections that do not end when they end. There are people who walk out the front door and somehow do not walk out of the soul. There are nights that seem ordinary while they are happening, and only later reveal themselves as thresholds. There are moments a woman thought she could survive casually, only to discover they entered her life like a key turning in a lock she did not know was there. That is the mystery no one talks about enough. What if intimacy is not just physical? What if something passes between two people that cannot be measured by modern language, but can still alter the atmosphere of a life? What if some of the exhaustion, confusion, attachment, and emotional unrest women carry is not only psychological, but spiritual? What if the body remembers more than the mind admits? What if the soul does not know how to treat casually what heaven never designed to be casual? These are not small questions. And they become even more haunting when a woman realizes that some of the things she thought were simply heartbreak were actually something deeper. Something more invisible. Something that did not just touch her emotions, but crossed into the hidden rooms of her inner life. Because not every loss is visible. Not every wound bleeds where others can see it. Not every haunting comes from a ghost. Some come from a memory that still has access. Some come from a bond that was formed in a moment and kept living long after the moment was gone. Some come from opening the body in ways that also opened the spirit. That is why this conversation matters. Not because I want to shock you for the sake of drama. Not because I want to turn tenderness into fear. Not because I want to shame any woman who has ever reached for closeness when she was lonely, weary, touch-starved, or quietly falling apart behind a beautiful life. This matters because too many women have carried consequences they were never warned about. They were told to be modern. They were told to be free. They were told that if something felt mutual, then it must be harmless. They were told that adults can separate sex from soul, body from spirit, desire from consequence. They were told that everything can be managed as long as it is consensual, private, and emotionally mature. But many women know, in the privacy of their own experience, that none of that is fully true. Because sometimes after intimacy, something changes. The room looks the same, but it does not feel the same. The mirror reflects the same face, but something behind the eyes has shifted. The morning arrives, but peace does not. A woman goes home carrying more than a memory. And the most unsettling part is that she may not even realize what she carried home until much later. Maybe it shows up as unusual attachment. Maybe it shows up as restlessness that did not exist before. Maybe it shows up as thinking about someone who was never truly safe, yet still feels impossible to release. Maybe it shows up as spiritual dullness, emotional heaviness, or a strange inability to return fully to herself. And if she has lived long enough, she may know exactly what I mean. Because a woman in the middle of life does not only give her body lightly, even when she tries to convince herself she does. She gives from the place where loneliness has accumulated. She gives from the place where years have passed without being deeply seen. She gives from the quiet ache of carrying too much for too long. She gives from the place that still hopes one moment of closeness might soften what strength has cost her. That is why the aftermath can feel so confusing. She did not think she was making a spiritual decision. She thought she was making a human one. She thought she was reaching for warmth. She did not know she might also be opening a door. And once that door is open, not everything that enters announces itself. Some things arrive quietly. Some things sound like longing. Some things feel like obsession. Some things disguise themselves as love. Some things live in the body as memory and in the soul as unrest. This is where the story becomes impossible to ignore. Because if intimacy opens more than skin, then what happens afterward matters more than most people have ever been told. If the unseen world is real, then private choices are not always private in the ways we imagined. If a bond can form deeper than words, then a woman may be suffering from more than a breakup. She may be carrying an invisible echo of what was never meant to stay. And that is what this video is going to uncover. If this kind of deep, honest storytelling speaks to something in you, subscribe to the channel and support this space. It helps this channel keep making videos that are thoughtful, emotionally true, and unafraid to go where shallow conversations never do. Because what I am about to say next may explain more of your life than you expected. Some people did not just pass through your arms. They passed into places inside you that have never been the same since. God never designed intimacy to be casual. There was a time when I thought the danger in intimacy was only emotional. I thought the worst thing that could happen was disappointment. A broken expectation. A late-night silence where warmth used to be. I thought the real risk was that someone might leave, or lie, or slowly become less tender than they were in the beginning. And while all of that is painful, I have come to believe those are only the visible edges of a much deeper truth. God never designed intimacy to be casual because He never designed the human soul to move casually through sacred things. That is where I have to begin. Not with shame. Not with fear. Not with the hard, cold language people often use when they want to talk about desire as if desire itself were the enemy. Desire is not the enemy. Hunger is not the enemy. The longing to be held, known, chosen, rested, and loved is not some embarrassing defect I need to apologize for. It is part of being human. It is part of being alive in a body that was created with the capacity for both tenderness and need. But what is holy can be mishandled. What is beautiful can be taken out of its right place. And what was created to bring safety, connection, and peace can become a source of confusion when it is separated from the structure that was meant to protect it. That is what I think many women feel without always knowing how to say it. The world speaks of intimacy as if it were self-contained, as if it begins and ends in the body. But the body is never the only thing present. My history is present. My loneliness is present. My hidden hopes are present. My wounds are present. My private ache is present. The parts of me that have gone untouched for too long are present. The parts of me that still want to believe closeness can repair what life has worn thin are present too. So when intimacy is treated casually, it is not just the body being asked to stay detached. It is the heart being asked to open without expecting safety. It is the soul being asked to share access without asking where that access leads. It is the spirit being asked to move through something sacred as if it were no heavier than impulse. But intimacy has weight. It always did. That is why I no longer hear God's design as mere restriction. I hear protection in it. I hear tenderness in it. I hear the mercy of a God who understands what a woman's inner life can suffer when her body is invited into a bond that has no covenant, no steadiness, no holy covering, no intention of carrying the full meaning of what intimacy actually awakens. Marriage, in this sense, is not just a social arrangement or a moral category. It is a shelter. It is the place where desire is not asked to pretend it means less than it means. It is the place where union is not severed from promise. It is the place where closeness is not built on uncertainty. It gives intimacy a home sturdy enough to hold its consequences. Outside of that shelter, the culture keeps telling me I should still be able to make it mean nothing. It tells me I am evolved enough to enjoy closeness without attachment, to separate pleasure from vulnerability, to give my body without giving my deeper self. It tells me I should be able to rename intimacy as experience, chemistry, release, companionship, anything except what it really is, an act with the power to open, join, imprint, and alter. And maybe that lie is easiest to believe when a woman is starving quietly, not starving for attention in the shallow sense. Starving for relief. Starving for gentleness. Starving for a place where she does not have to hold everything together. A woman can be deeply competent and deeply lonely at the same time. She can look stable in public and feel emotionally winded in private. She can be financially secure, spiritually sincere, physically disciplined, and still carry an ache that makes closeness feel less like temptation and more like water. That is what makes this so complicated. Because sometimes I was not reaching for rebellion. I was reaching for rest. I was not trying to be reckless. I was trying to feel less alone inside my own life. I was not chasing some dramatic escape. I was trying to quiet the exhaustion of always being the strong one, the sensible one, the one who can carry the emotional weather of a whole household without asking anyone else to notice what it costs. And in those moments, intimacy can look merciful. It can feel like a soft place to fall. It can feel like a private rescue from the ache no one else sees. But not everything that feels comforting is kind to the soul. That is one of the hardest truths I know. Because there is a kind of closeness that does not heal hunger. It only interrupts it. It gives a woman a momentary relief from emptiness, and then leaves her with a deeper form of it once the moment passes. It promises warmth, but not safety. It offers contact, but not covenant. It gives nearness without belonging. And the body may respond to that nearness as if something meaningful is happening, because something meaningful is happening. The tragedy is that the relationship itself may not be strong enough, honest enough, or sacred enough to carry the meaning of what it has awakened. This is why casual intimacy is not truly casual, even when both people insist that it is. The language is casual. The aftermath is not. The arrangement is casual. The imprint is not. The promises are casual. The opening inside a woman rarely is. I think this is especially true for women who are no longer young enough to believe every ache can be laughed off by next season. By midlife, a woman has lived enough to know that some experiences linger. Some seasons echo. Some forms of closeness touch old grief, old hope, old longing, and old fear all at once. She is not entering intimacy as an untouched person. She is entering with years behind her. Memories behind her. Losses behind her. A body that has carried stress. A heart that has survived disappointment. A soul that has learned how to endure, but not always how to rest. So when she steps into the wrong closeness, it does not only affect the present. It stirs layers. It wakes things up. It asks parts of her to trust that were not ready to trust. It asks her body to feel safe without giving her spirit a true place to land. That is why God's design is not small-minded. It is not punitive. It is not the denial of passion. It is the honoring of it. It is the refusal to reduce something powerful into something disposable. It is the wisdom to say that if intimacy can touch body, soul, memory, trust, longing, identity, and spiritual openness all at once, then it should not be entered lightly. That truth is not meant to humiliate me. It is meant to save me from calling expensive things cheap. Because intimacy is expensive. Not in money, but in meaning. It costs the body something. It costs the heart something. It costs the spirit something. It reaches into places that do not recover simply because I decide the experience was not serious. I can say that with my mouth. My inner life may still tell a different story. And perhaps that is why God never designed intimacy to be casual. Because He knows what it touches. He knows how far it travels once it enters a life. He knows that what begins as desire can become attachment, what begins as comfort can become confusion, and what begins as private closeness can become private sorrow when it lives outside the place where it was meant to be held. So His boundaries are not insults to my humanity. They are mercies for it. The moment two people become more than physical. There is a moment in intimacy that the world does not know how to name anymore. It is the moment when two people become more than physical, even if neither of them planned for that to happen. Even if no vows were spoken. Even if the relationship never had a clear title. Even if both people told themselves they were being realistic, mature, unattached, careful. There is still a threshold where something shifts. A line is crossed that cannot be explained by touch alone. I think many women have felt that moment without understanding it while it was happening. At first, it can seem ordinary enough. A conversation becomes a comfort. A comfort becomes a private world. A private world becomes trust. And trust, when it is mixed with longing, loneliness, admiration, or emotional relief, can begin opening doors inside me long before my body follows. By the time intimacy becomes physical, something deeper may already be underway. Something quieter. Something invisible. Something that does not begin with skin and does not end there either. That is why I no longer believe that intimacy is simply an act. It is an entry. It is a crossing. It is a moment when distance collapses in more than one dimension. Because when I give my body, I am never giving only my body. I bring my memory with me. I bring my private ache. I bring the version of myself that still wants to be chosen without fear. I bring the parts of me that have gone untouched for years, not only physically but emotionally and spiritually. I bring my hunger for tenderness. I bring the exhaustion of always appearing composed. I bring the fragile places I have hidden even from people who know me well. And so does the other person. He does not come to intimacy as a blank body either. He brings his history, his habits, his wounds, his unmet needs, his private darkness, his emotional patterns, his sense of self, his way of carrying desire, his beliefs about women, commitment, closeness, power, escape, and love. He brings what has shaped him, what has broken him, what has hardened him, and what still rules him in secret. Then something happens that modern language keeps trying to shrink. These two interior worlds touch. Not just hands. Not just mouths. Not just skin. Worlds. That is what makes intimacy so much more serious than people want it to be. It is not simply contact. It is mingling. It is not merely pleasure. It is exchange. It is not only passion. It is access. And access changes things. There are forms of closeness that do not stay where they start. They move inward. They travel through the body into memory, through memory into emotion, through emotion into attachment, and through attachment into the deeper architecture of the soul. That is why a woman can walk into intimacy thinking she is making one kind of choice and later realize she was making a far more layered one. She thought she was sharing a night. But she was also sharing entry into parts of her that do not know how to remain casual once opened. This is where the phrase one flesh begins to feel less like religious language and more like a painfully accurate description of reality. Because there is a kind of union that takes place in intimacy that exceeds explanation. Something joins. Something intertwines. Something begins to live in the space between two people that did not exist before, and once it exists, it does not always leave simply because the relationship changes its name. That is why some women struggle to detach even when their mind is clear. They know the relationship is unstable. They know the man is wrong for them. They know the connection is not leading anywhere holy, safe, or sustainable. And still, some part of them cannot simply switch it off. This is not always a failure of reason. Sometimes it is the evidence of joining. The body may have participated for one night, 1 month, 1 season. But the soul does not always keep the same calendar. The soul measures differently. It holds differently. It responds differently. It can remain bound to what the mind has already condemned. It can continue answering what wisdom has already told me to leave behind. That is why so many women feel confused by their own depth of attachment. They think, this was not even a real relationship. Or, we were never officially together. Or, it was complicated, undefined, hidden, unfinished. But definitions do not erase impact. Lack of commitment does not erase connection. Ambiguity does not prevent imprint. I may not have had clarity, but I still had union. I may not have had vows, but I still had exchange. I may not have had permanence, but I still had access. And that access can go farther than I expect. What touched my body may not stop at my body. It can move into the way I think, the way I sleep, the way I hope, the way I ache, the way I respond to distance, the way I interpret silence, the way I pray, the way I carry myself after he is gone. That is why I believe the moment two people become more than physical is not always the moment they first touch. Sometimes it is the moment trust and hunger join hands. Sometimes it is the moment I begin leaning emotionally where I should not be leaning spiritually. Sometimes it is the moment his attention starts reaching places in me that have been empty for too long. By the time intimacy becomes physical, the deeper union has already been preparing itself in hidden rooms. This matters especially for women in the middle of life. Because I am not entering intimacy from some untouched beginning. I am entering with years behind me, with disappointments behind me, with a body that has carried stress and self-control, with a heart that has survived silence, maybe even survived being unseen in places where I should have been cherished. So when someone finally reaches me in a place that has felt closed for years, the impact is not small. It is amplified by history. It is intensified by deprivation. It is deepened by the fact that what awakens in me was never merely desire. Sometimes it was grief meeting attention. Sometimes it was loneliness meeting warmth. Sometimes it was the starving parts of me mistaking nearness for safety. And once that kind of awakening happens, it can be very hard to tell myself it meant nothing. Because some connections do not remain on the surface. They descend. They move into the interior. They wrap around memory and longing until the relationship becomes larger inside me than it ever was in actual life. That is why parting can feel so brutal later. Not only because I lost someone, but because something of me had already crossed over into that bond. Something had already entwined. Something had already said yes at a level deeper than language. And when that bond is shaken, stretched, neglected, or broken, I do not experience the pain only as disappointment. I experience it as disturbance inside the places where I had quietly begun to join. The world calls this over-attachment, insecurity, emotional intensity. Sometimes it is simply the cost of becoming more than physical with someone who never understood what that meant. And that, perhaps, is the deepest sorrow in all of it. Not just that I was touched, but that I was joined in places too deep to treat lightly, and only understood the depth of it after the door had already opened. What crosses over in the unseen world? There is a reason some women walk away from intimacy and feel as if they brought something home with them that cannot be folded, washed, or explained. The sheets may be clean. The room may be quiet. The body may be back in its familiar routines. And yet the inner atmosphere feels altered, as though something crossed the threshold with me and stayed behind after everything visible was over. That feeling is easy to dismiss if I want to protect myself from harder questions. I can call it emotion. I can call it overthinking. I can call it hormones, vulnerability, attachment, loneliness, timing. Sometimes those things are part of the picture. But I do not believe they are always the whole picture. Because every person carries more than skin into intimacy. He brings a world with him. And so do I. He brings what has shaped him in secret. He brings what he has fed in darkness, what he has never healed, what he has normalized, what he has buried, what he has allowed to rule him in ways even he may not fully understand. He brings his appetites, yes, but also his wounds. He brings the patterns of his past, the way he handles shame, the way he uses silence, the way he flees discomfort, the things he has learned to crave, the fears he has never surrendered, the emotional climate he lives in when no one is watching. And I bring my own unseen world as well. My grief. My hunger. My weariness. The parts of me that still long to be gently held after years of carrying too much. The soft places I tell no one about. The old disappointments I thought I had healed. The hidden hope that maybe this closeness will soothe something life has left raw in me for too long. Then intimacy happens, and modern language tries to make it sound smaller than it is. We call it a night. A choice. A moment. Chemistry. Desire. Adult freedom. But what if what really happened cannot be reduced to any of that? What if intimacy is not only an exchange of touch, but an exchange of atmosphere? That word matters to me. Atmosphere. Because many women have felt it shift without being able to name it. They can sense when a room feels peaceful, tense, heavy, clear, restless, warm, disturbed. In the same way, my inner life has an atmosphere. My soul has weather. My spirit has a kind of air inside it. And there are connections that change that air. That is what I mean when I ask what crosses over in the unseen world. Not only affection. Not only memory. Something of the other person's inner climate can begin to move through the opening that intimacy created. If he carries chaos, I may begin feeling strangely unsettled even when my life outwardly looks calm. If he carries deep rejection, I may notice a new insecurity entering places in me that used to feel steady. If he lives with hidden lust, I may feel an agitation in my thought life that seems to intensify after him rather than quiet down. If he carries emotional darkness, numbness, manipulation, bitterness, or a disordered relationship with truth, I may begin feeling fogged, divided, heavy, or internally off-center in ways that do not match who I was before. This is why some women say, after the wrong intimacy, I do not feel like myself anymore. That sentence is more revealing than people realize. Because it does not always mean I am simply heartbroken. Sometimes it means I have become internally entangled with a life that brought more into me than I understood when I said yes. Sometimes it means I let someone near enough to leave more than a memory. He left a tone. A residue. A disturbance. A subtle occupation of space that had once belonged to peace. I think that is one of the most unsettling truths about the unseen world. Not everything that enters announces itself dramatically. Some things arrive quietly. They do not break the furniture of my life. They simply move into the hidden rooms. They sit down in places that used to belong to clarity. They dim things. They complicate things. They make rest harder to reach and discernment harder to trust. And because adult women are so practiced at functioning, they often keep living as though nothing has changed. They go to work. They answer texts. They return phone calls. They make dinner. They keep their appointments. They keep the outside of life moving while the inside begins to feel more crowded, more restless, more difficult to read. That is how unseen things work. They do not always stop the machinery. They alter the atmosphere. A woman may notice it first in small ways. Her thoughts no longer feel clean and spacious. Silence becomes uncomfortable. Prayer feels strangely difficult. Peace feels interrupted by a low-level agitation she cannot trace. She becomes more emotionally dependent on the connection than she wants to admit. She feels pulled toward the very thing that drains her. She begins carrying a heaviness that does not entirely feel like her own. That last part matters. Not all the weight I feel began with me. Not every cloud that moves through my inner life was born in my own heart. That is a frightening thought if I hear it without mercy. But it is a clarifying thought if I hear it with honesty. Because it explains why some relationships leave behind more confusion than comfort, more unrest than love, more inward disarray than visible meaning. It explains why I can know a man was wrong for me and still feel his effect in my body, my thoughts, my emotions, and my spiritual life long after the contact itself has ended. It also explains why some women mistake spiritual transfer for personal failure. They think they have become unstable. They think they are weaker than they used to be. They think they are irrational, dramatic, too attached, too sensitive. But what if some part of what they are carrying is the result of invisible exchange? What if intimacy gave access not only to their tenderness, but to their interior? What if the closeness they welcomed also opened a path for heaviness they never intended to invite? This is why I no longer think of intimacy as merely physical risk. It is spiritual permeability. It is the moment my inner walls become thinner, my hidden rooms become more reachable, my atmosphere becomes more vulnerable to what the other person lives under. And that is not a poetic exaggeration. Many women have felt this long before they found language for it. They have noticed how different two kinds of closeness can feel. One leaves them clean, calm, steady, safe. Another leaves them agitated, depleted, confused, and subtly fractured. The body may have been involved in both, but the atmosphere afterward tells a deeper story. Because what crosses over in the unseen world is not always visible in a single morning. Sometimes it takes days to feel it. Sometimes months. Sometimes years. Sometimes all I know is that peace thinned out after him, clarity dimmed after him, rest became more difficult after him, and some low ache began speaking in my life with a voice that was not there before. That is why this subject deserves reverence. Not panic. Not spectacle. Reverence. Because if intimacy can open a woman to the atmosphere of another person, then what she joins herself to matters more than the culture has ever prepared her to believe. And if something invisible can cross over through closeness, then the consequences of the wrong connection are not imaginary just because no one else can see them. Some people did not only leave fingerprints on my body, they left weather in my spirit. Why some people leave, but never fully leave. There are people I have not spoken to in years who can still disturb the silence inside me. That is one of the strangest forms of loss I know. Not the loss of someone who is still present enough to wound me in obvious ways, but the loss of someone who is absent in every visible sense and still somehow active in the hidden rooms of my life. No calls. No messages. No shared routines. No ordinary place in my days. And yet, now and then, something stirs. A song. A certain light in late afternoon. A passing thought before sleep. A name appearing where I did not expect it. And suddenly I feel the truth I have tried to outgrow. Some people leave, but they do not fully leave. I think this is where many women begin to question themselves unfairly. They wonder why they still feel something. They wonder why a bond they know was unhealthy still has a pulse. They wonder why someone they would never choose again can still evoke grief, longing, or a kind of internal ache that seems to survive reason. They wonder why time, which was supposed to soften everything, has not done the clean and complete work they hoped it would do. And because the world has such shallow language for attachment, women often call this weakness. They call it emotional excess. They call it being unable to move on. They call it nostalgia, unfinished business, low self-esteem, loneliness, or romantic confusion. Sometimes those words explain part of it, but not all of it. Not when the connection feels older than logic, deeper than memory, and more alive than it has any right to be after so much time has passed. There are absences that still behave like presences. That is what makes them so difficult to carry. A person can be gone from my actual life and still remain lodged in my inward one. I can build a new routine, move to a new season, become wiser, stronger, less naive, more discerning, and still find that some part of me reacts to the old bond as though it were not entirely over. It does not mean I want him back. It does not mean I have confused pain with love. It does not even always mean I miss the relationship itself. Sometimes what lingers is something quieter and more difficult to name. Sometimes it is the emotional imprint. Sometimes it is the spiritual bond. Sometimes it is the version of myself that came alive around him. That last part matters more than many people realize. Because there are relationships I do not miss for who the man truly was. I miss them for what they awakened in me. The softness. The hope. The sensation of being chosen. The temporary rest from carrying my life alone. The illusion that I had finally found a place where the hunger in me could settle. In that sense, what stayed behind was not only him. What stayed behind was the woman I became while I was near him. And losing that woman can feel almost as painful as losing the man. This is why some people never fully leave. Not because they were all that good, all that rare, all that irreplaceable, but because they became attached to deep places in me. Places tied to longing. Places tied to identity. Places tied to old wounds that mistook attention for healing. When those places are activated through intimacy, they do not simply fall silent because the relationship ends. They keep echoing. They keep remembering. They keep reaching toward what once made them feel briefly less alone. That is what makes certain goodbyes so haunting. They are not only endings. They are separations from what had already entered the interior. A woman can know with full clarity that a relationship was wrong for her and still feel pulled by it. She can know the man lacked honesty, maturity, safety, reverence, or the ability to love her well, and still find herself thinking of him in unguarded moments. This contradiction is one of the loneliest parts of adult heartbreak. To know better and still feel bound. To have outgrown the illusion and still carry the ache. To no longer respect the connection and still feel its residue living in the body and soul. That is not always a sign that I am foolish. Sometimes it is a sign that the bond reached deeper than I understood while I was inside it. The soul does not detach with the efficiency of the calendar. It does not always obey the timeline my pride would prefer. It does not say, enough months have passed, enough distance has been created, enough clarity has been gained, so now I will release this cleanly. It can remain tied to what life itself has already moved away from. It can keep answering an invisible knock long after the house has gone quiet. There is a sentence that comes to me when I think about this kind of lingering attachment. He was gone, but some part of me was still opening the door. That is how it feels sometimes. Not dramatic. Not obsessive in a way anyone else could easily see. Just a subtle inward readiness, as though some old connection still knows where I live. As though one mention, one memory, one emotional weather shift could wake something I thought had finally gone still. And this does not only happen with great loves. Sometimes it happens with unfinished loves. Ambiguous loves. Hidden loves. Relationships that never had enough form to be honored properly and never had enough truth to be grieved properly either. In some ways, those can linger the longest. Because what is unfinished tends to remain psychologically and spiritually active. The heart keeps trying to complete a story that never found its rightful ending. For women in the middle of life, this can be especially painful. By then, I have usually learned how to function through disappointment. I know how to keep going. I know how to show up. I know how to fold grief into a respectable life. But an old bond can still surface in moments when the outer noise falls away. A quiet evening. A long drive. A holiday that carries too much space. A moment in bed just before sleep when my defenses are down and memory is freer than I want it to be. That is when I realize some ties were never fully broken. They were only buried under routine. And routine is not the same as freedom. This is why the language of soul ties resonates with so many women, even if they have never spoken that phrase out loud. Because it describes something ordinary language often fails to capture, a connection that survives physical absence, an attachment that lives beyond mutual contact, a bond that seems to keep drawing emotional energy even after the visible relationship has ended. It is not merely remembering. It is being affected. It is being inwardly tugged by something that should, by all external logic, have lost its claim. That ongoing claim can shape future relationships too. A woman may be present with someone new and still feel a hidden comparison she never asked for. She may withhold fully trusting because some part of her is still occupied by a past connection. She may miss what was unhealthy simply because it was intense. She may confuse peace with dullness because chaos once taught her to call itself passion. In that sense, what never fully left does not stay harmless. It keeps influencing how I interpret closeness, risk, desire, safety, and love. That is why this kind of lingering matters. Not because I need to dramatize the past, but because what remains unresolved keeps speaking into the present. It keeps shaping what I reach for, what I fear, what I settle for, and what I mistake for intimacy. Some women are not only grieving an old relationship. They are carrying an old residence of the soul. A part of them still lives in a house they no longer physically inhabit. A part of them still walks the hallways of a bond that ended years ago. A part of them still turns toward a voice that no longer calls. And the sorrow in that is not only that someone left. It is that some piece of my inward life went with him and never fully found its way back. That is why I no longer believe every ending is complete just because contact has ended. Some endings are visible. Others remain unfinished in the unseen world. They remain active in memory, in longing, in bodily reaction, in private ache, in moments of emotional vulnerability when the past feels closer than the present. And until those bonds are faced honestly, they can keep living under the surface of an otherwise mature and functional life. Some people leave in the ordinary ways people leave. But the deeper question is whether they also left the rooms inside me where I once let them dwell. Because absence alone does not empty a soul. And silence alone does not untie what intimacy once bound. Why breakups after intimacy feel like a death no one sees. There is a kind of grief that does not receive flowers. No one brings soup to the door for it. No one lowers their voice when they speak your name. No one stands beside you in black clothing and acknowledges that something sacred has collapsed. There is no public ritual for this kind of loss, no socially recognized ceremony for the woman who wakes up one morning and realizes that a relationship has ended, but the ending is moving through her like a private death. That is what breakups after intimacy can feel like. Not only sadness. Not only disappointment. Not only the bruising of rejection. Death. Not in the literal sense, but in the way something once alive inside me suddenly has nowhere to go. Something I had been feeding with hope, touch, anticipation, emotional investment, and silent imagination is cut off from its future. It is still warm inside me while it is already gone outside of me. And that is what makes the experience so disorienting. The relationship can end in real time, but the soul often takes much longer to understand that it is standing in the wreckage of something it had already begun to build a home around. This is why heartbreak after intimacy feels so much heavier than people often expect. It is not just that I lost a person. It is that I lost the internal world that had formed around that person. I lost the version of tomorrow that had quietly started taking shape in me. I lost the imagined safety I had attached to his presence. I lost the tender rhythm my body had begun to expect. I lost the illusion that maybe this connection would become the place where all my late-life weariness could finally put its head down and rest. That kind of loss does not vanish just because no one else can see it. In fact, the invisibility of it is part of what makes it so severe. Because when grief has no witnesses, it often turns inward and becomes heavier. It has nowhere to go. It cannot stand upright in the world and say, "This mattered. This altered me. This left me walking around in the shape of someone who is still alive, yet carrying an absence that behaves like a death." Instead, I keep functioning. I keep replying to messages. I keep showing up where I am needed. I make the coffee. I fold the laundry. I remember the meeting. I call my sister back. I handle the practical life in front of me while something much less practical drags behind me like a shadow no one else knows to ask about. That is one of the loneliest things about adult heartbreak. By the time a woman reaches the middle of life, she has usually become very skilled at appearing steady. She knows how to move through pain without making other people uncomfortable. She knows how to keep her face composed. She knows how to carry sorrow with dignity. She knows how to say "I'm okay" in a voice that does not invite deeper questions. So when intimacy ends and grief enters, she often suffers in ways that are almost completely invisible to the people around her. Some grief wears mascara, drives to work, and answers emails. Some grief stands in line at the grocery store and smiles politely. Some grief makes dinner for other people and then cries in the bathroom where no one can hear it. That is why this kind of heartbreak can begin to feel almost unreal. Not because it is small, but because it is so hidden. I can look normal while carrying something that feels like internal collapse. I can sit through a meeting while part of me is still trying to understand why his absence feels like a room inside my chest has been stripped bare. I can be praised for how well I'm handling things while privately wondering why I feel as though something inside me has been buried without a funeral. And when sexual intimacy has been part of the relationship, the grief often becomes even more complex. Because then I am not only grieving conversation, companionship, or emotional closeness. I am grieving a bond that entered deeper territory. My body knew him. My nervous system knew his patterns. My evenings had started making space for his presence. My imagination had woven him into moments that had not happened yet. My private self had let him past doors most people never even noticed were there. So when he leaves, he does not leave an untouched landscape behind. He leaves a disrupted one. That disruption is part of why breakups after intimacy can feel so sharp, so disorienting, so difficult to explain. It is not simply that someone rejected me. It is that something once joined is now being torn apart without any visible blood. The wound is interior, but the pain is not less real for being hidden. If anything, it can feel even more consuming because there is nothing concrete to point to. No cast. No scar. No diagnosis. Just an ache so specific it seems to have its own intelligence. I think this becomes even more painful for women in the second half of life because heartbreak is rarely about one layer only. A breakup at this stage does not simply touch romance. It touches time. It touches identity. It touches the quiet fear that maybe I have run out of chances to begin again in some wholehearted way. It touches the humiliation of hoping after I told myself I would not hope like that anymore. It touches the part of me that believed maturity would make me less vulnerable to this kind of devastation, only to discover that age does not harden grief. It only changes the way grief dresses itself in public. There is also the strange shame that can come after such a breakup, especially if the relationship was undefined, hidden, morally complicated, or never fully acknowledged by the outside world. Then I am not only grieving the relationship. I am grieving it without permission. I do not feel entitled to mourn openly because there was no recognized status, no official language, no accepted script. So I become the sole witness to my own loss. I carry it in silence, and silence can make pain feel even more intimate. That is why some women stay stuck in heartbreak longer than they expected. Not because they are weak. Not because they are dramatic. But because what died was never fully seen while it was alive, so it is not fully honored in its ending either. The relationship may have looked small from the outside, but inside me it had roots. It had rituals. It had meaning. It had private architecture. And when that architecture collapses, the woman living inside it does not simply step into a new house the next morning. She stands for a while in the dust. There are moments when this grief announces itself in strangely ordinary places. In the car at a stoplight. In the kitchen when the light is too soft. In bed when sleep delays itself just long enough for memory to return. In the space after a long day, when distraction finally loosens its grip and the soul has no choice but to feel what it has been carrying. That is when the loss feels most like death, because there is no audience, no performance, no buffer. Just me and the absence, facing each other honestly. And what is absent is not only a man. It is the future I was quietly leaning toward. It is the softness I had started allowing again. It is the emotional shelter I believed I had found. It is the secret hope that maybe I would not have to be so strong anymore. That is why the pain can feel so total. Because what ended was not simply contact. What ended was a whole internal arrangement of trust, anticipation, and longing that had begun to organize itself around his existence. And when that arrangement dies, something in me has to learn how to breathe in a different emotional climate. No one sees how a soul can limp. That may be the truest sentence in all of this. Because from the outside, limping of the soul looks like normal life. It looks like competence. It looks like grace under pressure. It looks like maturity. But inside, I may be moving much more slowly than anyone realizes. Inside, I may still be carrying the heaviness of an ending that reached far deeper than language can comfortably explain. This is why breakups after intimacy feel like a death no one sees. Because something real has ended in a place where no one else was looking. Something alive has been severed in the hidden interior where attachment, memory, body, and hope had already become entwined. And the woman left behind must go on living while something inside her is still learning how to bury what once felt like part of her own future. It is a quiet kind of mourning. But quiet does not mean small. And unseen does not mean unreal. The body remembers what the mind tries to rename. There are things my body knows before my mind is willing to tell the truth. That may be one of the most humbling realities of being human. I can rename an experience. I can soften the language. I can call something casual, complicated, adult, mutual, temporary, even necessary. I can tell myself it was just a season, just loneliness, just a mistake, just a moment that meant less than it felt like it meant. The mind is very skilled at reducing what it cannot bear to fully face. It edits. It reframes. It protects dignity by changing vocabulary. It tries to rescue me from the full emotional and spiritual weight of what happened by making it sound smaller, cleaner, easier to survive. But the body is not nearly as interested in euphemisms. The body remembers what the mind tries to rename. It remembers the trembling before trust was given. It remembers the ache after nearness became absence. It remembers the tension, the comfort, the fear, the longing, the confusion, the surrender. It remembers the way a woman went toward someone not only with desire, but with need she did not know how to confess in any other language. That is why I no longer believe the body is merely a physical shell dragged behind the real life of the soul. The body participates in meaning. It stores experience. It records what words later try to rearrange. It keeps an archive of what happened in rooms no one else saw. And it does not always release those records simply because I decide I am done with the story. This matters more than many women realize. Because by the time a woman reaches the middle of life, she has often become highly intelligent about self-management. She knows how to function through disappointment. She knows how to compartmentalize. She knows how to keep going when something hurts. She knows how to present calm even when calm is not what she feels. She has lived long enough to understand the value of composure. But composure can make it very easy to misread the body. It can make me think I have processed something simply because I am still productive. It can make me believe I am healed because I am no longer publicly unraveling. Meanwhile, the body may still be carrying what the mind has prematurely labeled resolved. That is why a woman can say, "It meant nothing," and still feel a tightening in her chest when she thinks of him. She can say, "I've moved on," and still notice restlessness rising in her at night. She can insist, "It was not that serious," while her nervous system responds as though something far deeper was touched and then mishandled. The body is often less deceived than the mind. It tells the truth in sensations before the mouth is ready to admit that truth in language. A woman may feel it in the way she cannot settle after the relationship ends. In the way her sleep becomes thinner. In the way silence feels less peaceful than it used to. In the way she begins craving reassurance, attention, or contact that she once would have known she did not need. In the way old memories suddenly feel vivid inside the body, not only as thoughts but as atmosphere. The body can carry emotional aftermath like a room holds lingering smoke. Nothing visible may be burning anymore, and yet the air still tells the story. This is why the phrase "the body keeps score" resonates so deeply for many people, even outside spiritual language. Because the body does not experience intimacy as abstract. It experiences it as event, imprint, and memory. It receives touch, yes, but it also receives tone. It registers safety or instability. It absorbs whether I was cherished or merely accessed. It records whether what happened left me more whole or more divided. And perhaps this is where many women feel a quiet grief they do not know how to name. They realize that sometimes they used intimacy to negotiate with emptiness. Not because they were shallow. Not because they did not know better. But because there are seasons when exhaustion makes closeness look like medicine. A woman who has gone years without being deeply seen can mistake touch for restoration. A woman who has carried herself with competence for too long can mistake desire for safety. A woman who has felt emotionally starved can begin to believe that being wanted will calm the ache of being unseen. But the body knows the difference between being awakened and being held. It knows the difference between intensity and peace. It knows the difference between exposure and care. And when those things are confused, the body often bears the cost before the mind can form a coherent explanation. That cost may not always look dramatic. It may look like subtle fragmentation. Like feeling split inside. One part of me saying I should be fine, another part of me clearly not fine at all. One part of me wanting to dismiss what happened, another part refusing to cooperate with the dismissal. The body can become the place where contradiction is felt most honestly. The mind says it was freedom. The body feels the strain of having given sacred access to something that did not know how to honor what it touched. That is why the biblical image of the body as temple feels so important to me here. Not as a slogan. Not as a weapon. Not as some cold moral phrase people use to control women while ignoring their loneliness. I mean it in a deeper sense. A temple is a place of presence. A place of reverence. A place not meant for careless traffic. When I think of my body that way, I do not hear condemnation. I hear dignity. My body is not disposable. My body is not where I go to bargain for affection. My body is not a site where I should try to prove I am still lovable. My body is not separate from my spiritual life. That changes the emotional meaning of everything. Because once I understand my body as sacred space, I stop speaking about it as though it can pass through intimate experiences without consequence. I stop pretending the body can be casually joined while the soul remains untouched. I stop treating physical closeness as something I can simply define afterward according to whatever narrative feels least painful. The body does not submit that easily to revised storytelling. It knows what entered. It knows what lingered. It knows when something in me became more open than I was prepared to guard. And this may be why certain women feel ashamed without knowing why. Not because shame is always holy, but because somewhere within, the body is testifying that something was out of alignment. The woman may try to reason her way into peace. She may try to modernize her language, reduce the event, dress it in sophistication. But inwardly, she still feels unsettled. Not because she is weak, but because the body is bearing witness. It is saying, "This affected me. This reached further than you wanted to admit. This was not only a moment. This entered the deeper rooms." I think many women have spent years fighting that witness instead of listening to it. They called their distress prudishness, insecurity, emotional excess, religious conditioning, lack of experience, too much sensitivity. But perhaps some of what they were feeling was not dysfunction at all. Perhaps it was discernment living in the body before it found words in the mind. That is what makes this part of the journey so tender. Because truth does not only arrive through ideas. Sometimes it arrives through the body's refusal to let me keep calling fragmentation freedom. Through its resistance to my polished explanations. Through its quiet insistence that what happened in intimacy cannot be made harmless simply because I wish it had been. The body remembers because the body was there. It remembers what was opened, what was given, what was taken in, what was stirred, what was left behind. And until I honor that truth, my mind will keep trying to rename what my body has never actually forgotten. The quiet open doors, patterns that often begin after the wrong connection. Some doors do not swing open with noise. They do not announce themselves with disaster. They do not arrive looking like ruin. They do not shatter the visible structure of a life all at once. They open quietly, almost politely, and that is why they are so easy to misunderstand. A woman can still be functioning, still be admired, still be dependable, still look completely in control, while something inside her has begun admitting patterns she would have once recognized immediately as dangerous. That is what makes the wrong connection so deceptive. It rarely begins by asking for everything. It begins by asking for one compromise, one emotional exception, one private allowance, one small softening of boundaries that seemed unnecessary to defend in the warmth of being wanted. And because the human heart tends to notice relief before it notices consequence, I may not understand what has begun until the pattern is already living inside me. This is how quiet doors open. Not always through one dramatic fall, but through repeated interior consent. Through the slow normalization of what once would have troubled me. Through a subtle shift in what I permit, what I excuse, what I revisit, what I call love when it is really hunger, what I call chemistry when it is really confusion, what I call connection when it is actually a form of dependence. After the wrong intimacy, the consequences are not always immediate in ways the outside world can see. Sometimes the first evidence is inward. My thoughts begin circling someone who has not earned that kind of space in me. My peace becomes unusually dependent on whether I hear from him. My emotional center starts moving outside of me. I begin checking, waiting, scanning, rereading, replaying. I tell myself I am only thinking things through, but what I am really doing is living in a loop. That loop is one of the quietest open doors I know. Because obsession rarely feels like obsession in the beginning. It feels like concern, curiosity, attachment, hope, a need for clarity. But over time, it becomes exhausting. I keep returning mentally to what already left me depleted. I keep trying to solve something that was never asking to be solved, only surrendered. I keep granting emotional authority to someone who has already shown me that he cannot carry it with care. This is how the unseen world begins shaping visible life. Not only through crisis, but through patterns. A woman does not always collapse after the wrong connection. Sometimes she simply becomes less free, less clear, less anchored. Her life may still look intact, but her inner life has started reorganizing itself around unrest. She wakes up with heaviness she cannot explain. She loses the clean simplicity of her own discernment. She begins second-guessing what used to feel obvious. She tolerates what would once have grieved her immediately. She feels spiritually fogged, emotionally porous, easier to persuade away from what she knows is true. That is what I mean by an open door. It is not always something spectacular. Sometimes it is the quiet entrance of disorder into places that used to hold peace. I think many women are particularly vulnerable to this kind of pattern not because they are foolish, but because they are tired. A tired woman is not always looking for danger. More often, she is looking for relief. She wants tenderness without another battle. She wants comfort without another long explanation. She wants to stop bracing for a little while. And in that fatigue, what is misaligned can begin to look merciful. What is draining can begin to look necessary. What is spiritually costly can begin to feel emotionally worth it, at least for the moment. But the soul always pays attention to what the lonely heart is tempted to overlook. That is why certain patterns begin after the wrong connection. Anxiety grows louder. Shame becomes more familiar. The appetite for compromise increases. What once felt clearly off begins to feel normal. I start making room for confusion instead of confronting it. I call it patience. I call it complexity. I call it being understanding. But often I am just slowly adapting myself to a reality that is eroding me. There is a grief in that adaptation. Because a woman can lose herself in very refined ways. Not only through scandal, but through quiet self-abandonment. She stops listening to her own discomfort. She stops honoring the warning signs in her body. She stops trusting the clear voice inside her that once knew when something was wrong. She becomes a little easier to override, a little quicker to rationalize, a little more willing to live divided. And division has a cost. It is tiring to live one life outwardly and another inwardly. It is tiring to look composed while carrying turbulence no one else sees. It is tiring to keep explaining away what my spirit keeps trying to expose. That is why so many women in the middle of life feel exhausted without understanding that the exhaustion is not only physical. It is spiritual strain. It is the fatigue of carrying patterns that entered quietly and then settled in as though they belonged. Some of these patterns are emotional. Some are mental. Some are deeply spiritual. But they often work together. I begin craving what wounds me. I begin returning to what empties me. I begin feeling drawn to the very source of my confusion. I begin interpreting intensity as proof of meaning. I begin mistaking instability for passion because calm now feels unfamiliar. I begin believing that if something pulls on me strongly enough, it must be significant, even if the fruit of it is unrest. That is one of the saddest distortions the wrong connection can create. It can teach me to distrust peace. It can make clarity feel boring. It can make steady love seem too quiet. It can train my inner life to respond more easily to turbulence than to truth. And all of this can happen while I am still living what looks like a respectable life. I may still go to work, still care for people, still exercise, still cook dinner, still keep up with responsibilities, still show up looking capable. The outside can remain polished while the inside grows increasingly misaligned. That is why outward success is such a poor measure of inward freedom. A woman can be functioning beautifully and still be inwardly entangled in patterns that are diminishing her. Not every collapse is loud. Sometimes the deepest loss is the loss of inner rest. The loss of simple discernment. The loss of the ability to sit in silence without being pulled back toward someone or something that never brought life. The loss of a clear center. This is why the quiet open doors matter so much. Because once patterns form, they begin interpreting life for me. They shape what I expect, what I fear, what I crave, what I excuse, and what I call normal. And if I do not face them honestly, I may spend years managing symptoms without ever naming the entry point. The wrong connection does not only leave behind memories. It can leave behind pathways, habits of thought, emotional dependencies, spiritual vulnerabilities, a new ease with compromise, a subtle distance from the self God meant me to live from. That is why some women do not need more information nearly as much as they need recognition. They need to see that what changed after that connection was not imaginary. Something opened. Something entered. Something began repeating itself. And repetition is how bondage often hides. Quietly, respectably, persistently, until one day a woman realizes that everything in her life still runs, but something inside her no longer rests. That is when the truth becomes unavoidable. The open door was never only about one night, one person, one decision. It was about what that decision allowed to begin. Nothing is beyond redemption, breaking what was never meant to stay. There comes a point when a woman grows tired of merely surviving what should have been released. She may not use those exact words at first. She may only know that she is weary in a place rest has not reached. She may only know that too much of her inner life still belongs to something she no longer wants to belong to. She may only know that she has carried a bond, a memory, a heaviness, a pattern, a grief, a residue for far longer than she ever imagined she would. But beneath all of that exhaustion is a deeper truth quietly waiting to be faced. What was never meant to stay does not have to stay forever. That is where redemption begins for me. Not in denial. Not in pretending the damage was small. Not in calling darkness light so I can avoid the ache of honesty. Redemption begins when I finally stop trying to make peace with what has been stealing peace from me. It begins when I tell the truth about what entered my life, what attached itself to me, what I invited out of loneliness, what I excused out of hunger, what I carried home and then kept carrying long after the relationship itself was gone. There is something sacred about that kind of truth-telling. Not theatrical confession. Not the performance of brokenness. Just the plain and trembling honesty that says, "This marked me more than I wanted to admit. This bond went deeper than I understood. This connection did not leave when I thought it would. This memory is not innocent. This pattern is not harmless. This ache is not just emotional anymore. Something in me has remained occupied by what should have already been gone." That kind of honesty does not destroy a woman. It is often the first place she begins to return. Because what remains hidden usually remains powerful. What stays unnamed often keeps its influence. What I refuse to bring into the light does not become weaker through neglect. It simply goes underground and keeps speaking from beneath the surface of my life. It shapes my reactions, my cravings, my grief, my choices, my sense of self, the way I approach closeness, the way I protect myself, the way I keep reaching back toward what never brought me peace. So the mercy of God is not only that He forgives what I have done. It is that He draws me toward truth so that what has remained hidden can finally lose its hold. This is why I do not believe repentance is a narrow or punitive word. I believe it is one of the most tender words in the spiritual life when it is rightly understood. Repentance is not self-hatred. It is not groveling. It is not turning my pain into a spectacle. Repentance is the moment I stop defending what wounded me. It is the moment I stop romanticizing what drained me. It is the moment I stop calling it love simply because it was intense, or calling it freedom simply because I chose it, or calling it harmless simply because no one else saw how deeply it touched me. Repentance is the place where I withdraw my agreement. That matters more than many women realize. Because sometimes bondage is not only in the original act. Sometimes it is in the continuing agreement. The agreement that this still owns part of me. The agreement that I will always be marked by it. The agreement that this ache is just part of who I am now. The agreement that I cannot really be free, cannot really be clean, cannot really come back from this, cannot really become inwardly whole again. Those agreements are subtle, but they are powerful. They keep old doors from closing. They keep old names whispering over the identity God is trying to restore. So there comes a moment when I have to say no. Not only no to the man. Not only no to the memory. No to the lie. No, this does not get to define me forever. No, this attachment does not get to keep feeding on my attention. No, this residue does not get to remain in the rooms of my soul as if it belongs there. No, this pattern is not entitled to another year of my life. No, this open door does not stay open simply because it has been open for a long time. That refusal is holy. Not loud. Not glamorous. Holy. And often, it becomes practical long before it becomes emotional. That is one of the most important things I have learned. Freedom is not always a feeling at the beginning. Sometimes it is a decision made in trembling. Sometimes it looks like naming what happened before God without editing it for dignity. Sometimes it looks like saying the names I have avoided saying because vagueness allowed me to stay attached. Sometimes it looks like taking old messages off my phone, not because deleting them erases the past, but because keeping them has become a ritual of quiet bondage. Sometimes it looks like refusing to revisit conversations in my head that only deepen the groove of longing. Sometimes it looks like telling the truth in prayer. I have been carrying something I do not want to carry anymore. I have been living with something that no longer gets to live here. There is power in that kind of naming. Because what is brought clearly before God is no longer allowed to remain fog. And so many women live in fog. Not because they are dishonest in some dramatic sense, but because they have learned to survive through vagueness. They say things like, "It was complicated. It was a season. It was lonely. It was what it was." But sometimes the soul cannot be healed in vague language. Sometimes freedom requires precision. Not cruelty, not shame, but precision. I entered something God did not bless. I bonded in a place where I was not covered. I let someone into rooms that belonged to reverence. I have continued carrying what should have already been broken. And I am ready now to stop carrying it. That is not condemnation. That is alignment beginning. I also think redemption is deeper than many women dare to hope. We often imagine forgiveness in spiritual terms but remain skeptical about cleansing in emotional and interior terms. We think perhaps God forgives the act, but we quietly assume the imprint is permanent. We think maybe heaven releases us legally, but inwardly we are still doomed to carry the echo, the contamination, the attachment, the old atmosphere. Yet the mercy of Christ is not thin like that. He does not only pardon sin in a distant, abstract way. He enters the places sin disturbed. He can cleanse the inner rooms that have felt unclean. He can confront the things that attach themselves through pain, desire, compromise, and spiritual ignorance. He can untangle what I do not know how to untangle on my own. That does not mean the process is shallow. It is often intimate. Slow in some places. Immediate in others. But it is real. And sometimes healing begins with reclaiming the ordinary spaces where the residue of the past has quietly lived. A woman may need to pray over the bedroom that has become a chamber of memory. She may need to sit in the chair where she has rehearsed old conversations 100 times and choose silence before God instead. She may need to open the windows and let the room breathe, not because the air itself is magical, but because the act says something to her own soul. I am no longer preserving what hurt me. I am no longer decorating the place where I was diminished. I am no longer calling this heaviness home. That matters. The body needs to know release is permitted. The mind needs to know the story is no longer sovereign. The soul needs to know the past is not the landlord anymore. And perhaps that is what redemption feels like in real life. Not a dramatic erasure of memory, but a breaking of ownership. The past may still exist as fact, but it no longer sits on the throne of my interior. The bond may once have been real, but it is no longer rightful. The ache may have shaped me, but it no longer gets to govern me. What attached itself to me does not get to rename me. What entered through an open door does not get permanent residence. What was never meant to stay must eventually be told to leave. This is where so many women need hope that is deeper than encouragement. Not the shallow comfort of being told everything will be fine. Not the forced brightness that skips over the seriousness of what happened. Something better than that. The hope that holiness is not sterile. The hope that God can restore what compromise disordered. The hope that a woman is not permanently exiled from herself because she crossed lines while lonely, tired, touch-starved, or desperate for a form of tenderness she did not know how to ask for rightly. The hope that there is still a way back, not to some naive version of herself, but to a truer one. A cleaner one. A quieter one. A more inwardly gathered one. I think that is what the grace of God does at its deepest level. It does not flatter me. It restores me. It does not ask me to minimize the weight of what happened. It teaches me how to set that weight down without becoming crushed by it. It does not merely comfort the wound. It breaks the right of the wound to keep ruling the whole life around it. That is why nothing is beyond redemption. Not the memory that still feels warm with ache. Not the bond that has lasted far too long. Not the body that remembers. Not the mind that keeps circling. Not the spirit that has felt crowded. Not the woman who knows better now, but did not know better then. Nothing is beyond redemption because the mercy of God reaches further than the damage did. And what was never meant to stay does not get to stay forever once truth, repentance, and the presence of God begin to fill the rooms where it once lived. Closing the door and coming back to myself. There is a difference between ending a connection and closing the door it opened inside me. That difference is where many women quietly live for years. A person can be gone, the relationship can be over, the phone can be silent, the routines can be broken, the memories can even lose some of their sharpness, and still the inner door remains open. Not visibly. Not in the dramatic ways people usually imagine. But inwardly. In the way a woman still turns back emotionally when nothing in her actual life is asking her to turn back. In the way certain thoughts still have access to her peace. In the way old attachments continue to breathe inside rooms that should have belonged to rest by now. That is why this final part matters so much. Because there comes a point when I no longer want to spend my life standing in the doorway of what hurt me. I no longer want to keep one part of myself facing forward while another part keeps listening for footsteps from something that should have already passed. I no longer want to call this wisdom, maturity, nostalgia, complexity, or emotional depth when sometimes it is simply an unfinished return. A return not to him, but to me. A return to the self I left scattered across compromises, false comforts, private griefs, and connections that entered too deeply and stayed too long. Coming back to myself is not a trendy phrase to me. It is a sacred one. Because there are ways a woman can leave herself without ever physically going anywhere. She can leave herself in relationships where she keeps overriding what she knows. She can leave herself in moments where she confuses being desired with being cherished. She can leave herself in patterns where she becomes easier and easier to persuade away from her own discernment. She can leave herself in grief that was never properly named, in loneliness that kept reaching for the wrong medicine, in bonds that taught her to measure love by intensity instead of peace. And after enough of that, she may still look like herself on the outside while inwardly she feels displaced. Functional, but not gathered. Capable, but not settled. Alive, but not entirely at home within her own life. I think that is the ache many women carry in the middle years. Not always devastation. Sometimes estrangement. A quiet distance from themselves. They have learned how to keep life moving. They know how to be strong, useful, emotionally intelligent, financially responsible, spiritually respectable. But beneath all of that, something in them is still wandering the halls of old hunger, old sorrow, old attachment, old agreements with things that no longer deserve residence. That is why closing the door is not merely about rejecting the past. It is about reclaiming presence. It is about saying, I live here again. My peace lives here again. My body belongs here again. My thoughts are no longer rented out to what weakened me. My evenings are no longer an altar to what is over. My tenderness is no longer available to what has no covering, no covenant, no intention of protecting what it touches. That kind of closing is not harsh. It is holy. And it is often quieter than people expect. Sometimes closing the door is not one dramatic moment. Sometimes it is a series of steady refusals. I refuse to keep romanticizing what left me divided. I refuse to keep making room in my imagination for what God has asked me to release. I refuse to keep treating a wound like a romance. I refuse to let an old attachment shape the emotional climate of my present life. I refuse to keep calling confusion by beautiful names. Those refusals are not bitterness. They are the architecture of return. Because every closed door creates the possibility of inward order. Every boundary restored makes it easier for the soul to hear itself again. Every place where I stop feeding an old attachment becomes a place where something cleaner can breathe. And for a woman who has lived too long with private unrest, breathing again is no small thing. I think one of the deepest lies women absorb is that if they have been lonely, they cannot trust themselves. If they crossed lines, they cannot return with dignity. If they gave too much away, they must live permanently altered in some defeated sense. But that is not what I believe anymore. I do not believe a woman is ruined because she was hungry in the wrong direction. I do not believe she is disqualified because she reached for closeness at a moment when she was tired of being the one who always held herself together. I believe she may have been wounded. I believe she may have been opened in the wrong place. I believe she may have let the wrong thing too near. But I do not believe that means she is beyond return. In fact, I think many women are closest to true return when they stop trying to perform strength and begin choosing truth. Not glamorous truth. Not social media truth. Quiet truth. The truth that says maybe what I called love was sometimes hunger. Maybe what I called freedom was sometimes fragmentation. Maybe what I called chemistry was sometimes the beginning of confusion. Maybe what I called coping was actually self-abandonment dressed in adult language. That kind of honesty is painful, but it is also clean. And cleanliness matters. Not in a rigid, moralistic sense. In a spiritual and emotional one. There is a kind of clean peace that returns when I stop living in contradiction. When I stop offering access where there is no safety. When I stop revisiting what keeps stealing life from me. When I stop forcing my body, mind, and spirit to make peace with what they were never meant to normalize. That peace does not make me hard. It makes me coherent. It gathers me back into one life instead of leaving me split between what I know and what I still keep entertaining. That, to me, is one of the most beautiful forms of healing, coherence. To no longer live divided. To no longer smile through what my spirit keeps grieving. To no longer call myself healed while I am still secretly kneeling at the threshold of something broken. To no longer let old weather move through me as though it still owns the sky. Coming back to myself also means coming back to God in a deeper way than performance ever allowed. Not as the woman who has everything polished and under control. Not as the woman who has learned the right words but still feels inwardly scattered. But as the woman who is finally ready to be inhabited by peace again. The woman who is tired of making a home for unrest. The woman who wants her inner life to become simple enough to hear God without static. That desire is not weakness. It is wisdom earned through ache. Because there is a stage in life when a woman stops being impressed by intensity. She stops mistaking attention for intimacy. She stops admiring what exhausts her. She stops calling emotional turbulence depth. She begins to hunger for something quieter, truer, more reverent. Something that does not demand she betray herself in order to feel briefly less alone. I think that is what holiness begins to look like in real life. Not perfection. Not performance. Not a brittle kind of righteousness that cannot bear the truth of human longing. Holiness, at its most lived and tender level, is the return of right order. The body no longer being used to bargain for comfort. The mind no longer circling what God is asking me to release. The heart no longer enthroning what wounded it. The spirit no longer carrying rooms full of people who were never meant to live there. There is deep mercy in that kind of order. There is rest in it too. And perhaps rest is what many women have been seeking all along, even in the wrong places. Not excitement. Not drama. Not endless reinvention. Rest. A place where they can stop negotiating with ache. A place where love does not leave residue. A place where their soul does not have to brace. A place where who they are is not constantly being scattered by what they keep letting in. That place begins, in part, when the door closes. Not because I become cold. Not because I stop needing tenderness. Not because I no longer remember. But because I finally understand that not every entrance deserves continued access to my interior life. And once I understand that, I begin to feel something I have missed for a very long time. I begin to feel near to myself again. Near to the woman beneath the coping. Near to the woman beneath the performing. Near to the woman God still recognizes even after all the wrong turns, lonely choices, and invisible wounds. She is still there. She is not gone. She is waiting in the quiet, where truth and mercy finally meet. And maybe that is the most important thing I can say at the end of all this. I am not beyond return. I am not too late for peace. I am not forever bound to what once entered me in confusion. I am not condemned to live split between longing and wisdom. I am not required to remain haunted by what should have already been released. I can close the door. I can come back to myself. And in that return, I may discover something gentler and stronger than the life I was trying so hard to protect through false comfort. Not a louder life. Not a shinier life. A truer one. A more rested one. A more gathered one. A life in which I no longer confuse being touched with being known, or being wanted with being safely loved. A life in which the interior becomes home again. You're not broken. You're just in the middle.